The snow on East 123rd Street had been packed down by foot traffic since the early morning, and by the time the teenagers arrived with their shovels, it had the particular quality of city snow in its second or third day, gray at the edges, compacted into a hard crust near the gutters, still white and loose in the middle of the block where fewer people had walked. The sound of the shovels against the pavement was the sound of that whole winter morning, a dry, rhythmic scraping that carried in the cold air above the street, and then stopped. It stopped because one of the boys noticed something moving in the open manhole. The date was February 9th, 1935. The street was in East Harlem, close to the river. The manhole was open, left accessible by a maintenance crew, or shifted by the freeze-thaw cycle of the pavement, or simply unremarkable in the way that open manholes were unremarkable on working streets in that part of the city in that decade. What was not unremarkable was what the boys saw moving inside it. The animal was dark, it was very large, and it was, by any reasonable standard of taxonomy, an alligator. What followed was the kind of improvised, practical response that turns up in old newspaper accounts and nowhere else, a quality of doing what needed to be done that belonged entirely to a particular era of city life. The boys found a rope. They lowered it into the manhole. They worked together to haul the animal up through the opening and onto the surface of the snow-covered street, where it lay in the February light, enormous and cold and alive. The New York Times reported the incident in its February 10th edition. The paper's account described the animal as approximately 7.5 feet in length, weighing somewhere near 125 pounds, a substantial animal, not a hatchling, not a small specimen that might plausibly be explained away as a novelty pet in its first year of life. The account was brief, written in the matter-of-fact register that city newspapers used in that period for stories that were strange, but not apparently strange enough to require extensive explanation. An alligator had been found in a Harlem manhole. Several teenagers had pulled it out with a rope. There it was, in print, what the newspaper account did not do, and what no account produced in the weeks or months that followed did either, was explain how the animal had come to be there in the first place. The 1935 incident was documented in the way that many strange urban events are documented. The surface details were recorded, the names were noted, and the deeper question of origin was left sitting open like the manhole itself. This is one of the things that makes the event so interesting to sit with. Even now, it has a date and a street address and a newspaper record behind it. It is, in the precise sense of the word, documented, and yet it remains at its factual core, a story about an animal that was where it had no obvious business being, with no clear account of how it had arrived. The New York Times was not, in those years, the only paper publishing accounts of this kind. Throughout the 1930s, the city's newspapers printed occasional reports of alligators appearing near streets and waterways and drainage infrastructure, sporadic, scattered, but present in the record in a way that gave isolated rumors the weight of institutional print. When a single newspaper publishes a single account, it is easy to treat it as an anomaly, a curiosity to be noted and set aside. When several papers publish several accounts over the course of a decade, something different begins to happen in the way those accounts are read and remembered. The events accumulate. They begin to suggest a pattern, or at least the possibility of one. And the possibility of a pattern, once it takes hold in a city's collective imagination, is not easily dislodged. 3 years before the East Harlem incident, in 1932, an alligator had been reported and captured near a lake in the Bronx. The details of this earlier encounter are less richly recorded than the 1935 story, No rope-wielding teenagers, no precise measurements printed in a major newspaper. But the fact of it sits in the record as evidence that alligators were appearing in New York City environments before the sewer legend had taken its familiar shape. The animal found in 1932 was not pulled from a manhole. It was not described as lurking in any underground infrastructure, but its presence in the city, in a borough that is not natural alligator habitat by any definition, pointed toward the same unanswered question: where were these animals coming from, and why were they showing up in a city this far north? Part of the answer, not all of it, but a meaningful part, lies in what was happening in novelty shops and mail order catalogs across the United States throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1960s. Baby alligators were, in that period, a remarkably accessible commodity. For somewhere between $1 and $2, a person could purchase a live hatchling alligator from a dime store, a tourist shop, or a mail order company that would ship the animal directly to a residential address in a cardboard box. Florida was the primary source, its coastal and inland waters producing alligators in large enough numbers that small-scale commercial collection was entirely viable as a business. The animals were marketed as pets, unusual, affordable, the kind of thing that appealed to people who wanted something distinctive, something that would prompt conversation, something that demonstrated a particular kind of adventurousness in the person who owned it. This is worth pausing on for a moment. The idea of a hatchling alligator as a common commercial item, available for less than the price of a decent lunch in a city diner, sits at a considerable distance from the way most people now think about these animals. But in the 1930s and 1940s, the regulatory framework that now governs the sale and ownership of reptiles did not exist in anything like its current form. Conservation legislation protecting alligators specifically was decades away. The American alligator would not be listed as an endangered species until 1967, and the protective designation would not be formally extended under the Endangered Species Act until 1973. In the intervening decades, the animals moved through commercial channels freely. They appeared in pet shop windows. They were shipped in cardboard boxes via standard mail. They were kept in bathtubs and kitchen sinks, and small glass aquariums in city apartments. The natural endpoint of this arrangement was, in many cases, predictable. A hatchling alligator at 9 inches is manageable in a way that a 3-foot alligator is not. A 3-foot alligator is manageable in a way that a 5-foot alligator is absolutely not. The animals grew, slowly but steadily, and the people who had purchased them on impulse or out of curiosity found themselves in possession of something they were no longer equipped to care for. Some animals were presumably killed. Some were donated to zoos which had limited capacity and even more limited enthusiasm for receiving surrendered novelty pets. And some, this is the thread that runs directly to the sewer legend, to the rope and the manhole and the February morning, were released. A city provides particular release opportunities: a river, a park pond, a storm drain, an open manhole on a quiet street early in the morning. The specific path that any individual animal took from a cardboard shipping box to a sewer access point is in almost every case unknowable, but the general plausibility of that path is not difficult to trace. New York City in the 1930s was a city where novelty alligator ownership was genuinely common enough to generate a small but consistent stream of animals that needed to go somewhere. The 125-pound animal that the Harlem teenagers hauled out of a manhole in 1935 was not, on this reading, a creature of mysterious origin. It was, most likely, a released pet that had grown considerably larger than its original owner had anticipated. The question of what happened to it after it reached the surface of East 123rd Street is also worth noting. The newspaper account records that the animal was eventually killed. The boys, having hauled it out of the manhole, found that the alligator was less cooperative above ground than it had been below, and the encounter ended in the way that encounters between large, distressed reptiles and groups of teenagers in a New York winter tended to end in 1935. The animal was not transported to a facility. It was not studied or tagged or preserved in any formal sense. It was, after its brief appearance in the documentary record, gone. What was not gone was the story. Robert Daly's 1959 book, Asterisk, The World Beneath the City, Asterisk, brought a second layer of institutional weight to the legend of sewer alligators. Daly was a journalist, and his book was a non-fiction account of the physical infrastructure beneath New York City's streets, the tunnels and pipes and buried waterways that most residents of the city passed over daily without any awareness of what lay below them. Among the accounts Daly collected was one attributed to Teddy May, who had served as superintendent of sewers for New York City. May claimed, according to Daly's account, that alligators had genuinely established themselves in sections of the city's sewer system during the 1930s. Not as occasional strays, not as isolated animals that had wandered in and quickly died, but as a small, apparently self-sustaining presence in the dark and warm channels beneath the streets. May's account, as Daly recorded it, had the quality of a story told by someone who had been there. The details were specific. Alligators in particular sections of the system, workers who had encountered them, a campaign that May claimed to have personally organized to address the problem, involving men with flashlights moving through the brick-lined tunnels beneath Manhattan and dealing with the animals they found there. The account had the texture of genuine administrative memory, the kind of story a city official might tell about an unusual problem he had actually managed, with the particular specificity that comes from having stood in the place being described. It also had no independent verification. The records of the Department of Public Works from the relevant period did not confirm May's claims. No contemporaneous documentation has been produced that supports the account of an organized campaign to clear alligators from the sewer system. The story exists in the evidentiary record as a compelling and detailed account told by a named official source to a journalist who published it in a nonfiction book, which is a meaningful thing, but is not the same thing as confirmed historical fact. May have been remembering something real, filtered through decades and the particular tendencies of memory. He may have been describing rumors he had heard as though they were experiences he had had. He may have been in the way that people who have spent their careers in interesting places sometimes are, embellishing in ways that were invisible even to him. What the Daily account did, whatever its relationship to verifiable fact, was provide the sewer alligator legend with a named source. This matters in ways that are easy to underestimate. A legend without a named source is a rumor. A legend with a named source, especially a named official source, a superintendent of sewers, a person with professional authority over the very infrastructure being described, becomes something closer to testimony. It becomes a story that can be cited, repeated with an air of documentary precision, passed on to the next person with the specific rhetorical weight of the attributed account, not people say, but according to the man who ran the sewers. The baby alligator trade was the material condition that made all of this possible. Without a steady commercial supply of hatchlings arriving in city apartments throughout the 1930s, there would have been nothing to release into city infrastructure. Without released animals finding their way into the drainage system, which the 1935 East Harlem incident demonstrates is at least plausible, the Teddy May account would have had no soil in which to grow. Without the Teddy May account, as repeated in a journalist's published book 2 decades after the fact, the legend would have remained a local anecdote, the kind of story that circulates in a single neighborhood before fading. Instead, by the late 1950s, it had acquired a specific weight of apparent official confirmation, the kind of credibility that only someone with genuine institutional authority can lend to a story. Imagine the dime store window on a block somewhere in Manhattan, or Brooklyn, or the Bronx, sometime in the 1940s. The glass is slightly clouded where the cold outside meets the warmer air within. Behind it, among the other items arranged to attract the attention of someone passing by, a small tank sits on a shelf. Inside the tank, in an inch or two of water, a dark-scaled animal, approximately 9 inches long, is resting with the particular quality of stillness that very young reptiles have. Not sleeping, exactly, but not fully engaged with anything either, simply occupying the space of its small glass world with the unhurried patience of a creature whose evolutionary history stretches back to a time that predates almost everything else visible from that sidewalk. The price tag, handwritten, leans against the glass. The number on it is small. It is the kind of number that a person can produce from a coat pocket without any particular deliberation, the kind of number that makes an impulsive purchase feel manageable. The animal in the tank is not looking out at the street. It has no interest in the pedestrians passing the window, but it is alive, and it is available, and for the cost of a few meals, a curious person can take it home to a city apartment and begin the particular experiment of keeping an alligator in a northern city. Most of those experiments ended quietly. The animal stopped eating, or grew faster than expected, or proved more difficult to house than the initial purchase had suggested. Most of the animals that arrived in city apartments in those years left them in ways that left no trace in any record. But some of them, enough of them it appears, to generate the occasional newspaper account, the occasional municipal alarm, the occasional rope hauled up through an open manhole on a February morning in East Harlem, made their way into the city's infrastructure, into its drains and its access points and its long, dark underground channels. Think about how many cardboard boxes, across the span of those 3 or 4 decades, arrived at city apartment buildings containing live alligators packed for shipping. Think about the particular moment of opening such a box, the recipient knowing in a general sense what was inside, but still experiencing the specific surprise of the animal's actual presence, its actual weight and texture, and the way its dark eyes caught the light of the apartment when the cardboard flap was lifted away. That moment, repeated across many years and many buildings and many neighborhoods, was the origin of the sewer legend in its most material sense. Not the newspaper account, not the Teddy May story, not any single event on any single February morning. The origin was the box, and the question of how many of those boxes were opened in New York City across all those years, and how many apartments, by how many people who had sent away $1 or $2 and waited for a remarkable animal to arrive. That question sits quietly in the record, interesting and essentially unanswerable, like the manhole on East 123rd Street, with the cold winter air rising out of it, and the sound of the shovels stopped. But the street, and the morning, and the newspaper report exist. That is what is remarkable about this particular legend, and what gives it a different quality from the more familiar kind of urban story that floats free of any verifiable anchor point. Most legends begin in the general, in the accumulated sense that something happened somewhere to someone in circumstances that have grown too vague to reconstruct. This one begins in the specific, a street, A date, a newspaper folded flat on a table somewhere in the city the next morning, its dense columns of type carrying a brief, matter-of-fact paragraph about an unusual event on a Harlem block. The New York Times account of the 1935 incident is, by the standards of what it could have been, remarkably restrained. There is no attempt to situate the event within a larger narrative of urban strangeness. There is no speculation about how the animal had come to be in the manhole, or how long it might have been there, or what its presence might suggest about similar animals in similar locations beneath other streets. The paper recorded what had been observed and moved on. The animal had been there. The teenagers had found it. The rope had been employed. The number 7.5 feet had been measured or estimated and noted. The weight of 125 pounds had been offered. The event was done. This restraint, the flat institutional reportorial neutrality of the original account, is part of what has given the 1935 incident its strange durability. An overwritten story provides its own interpretation, tells the reader how to feel, pre-digests the strangeness into the emotional package the writer has chosen. A matter-of-fact paragraph leaves all of that work to the reader, and different readers across different decades have done different kinds of work with it. Some have read it as confirmation of the Teddy May story. Some have read it as evidence that the sewer legend has a genuine documentable origin. Some have read it simply as a record of a genuinely odd winter morning in East Harlem, a thing that happened and was noted, and then, as far as the newspaper was concerned, was complete. The paragraphs in the Bronx account from 1932 have a similar quality. An alligator had been found near a lake. It had been captured. The fact had been recorded. The question of how it had come to be there was left to the reader to consider, which is to say, it was left largely to the reader's own sense of what was possible and what was not, their own estimation of whether a commercial pet market in live reptiles could produce the specific outcome of an alligator appearing in a public park in a Northern American city. It could. That is the answer. The biology and the commerce of the period support when examined together. The pet trade created the animals. The inevitable mismatch between a hatchling's manageable scale and an adult's unmanageable one created the pressure to dispose of them. The city's infrastructure created the access points, and the result, across the 1930s and into subsequent decades, was a scattering of documented incidents involving alligators in places where alligators had no obvious natural business being. Not in Florida, not in the Gulf coastal plain, but in the Bronx and in East Harlem, and if the Teddy May account is given any credence at all, in the brick-lined sewer channels beneath Manhattan streets. There is something genuinely interesting about the specific texture of that February morning in 1935 when held against what the documentary record makes available. Snow on a Harlem street, a group of teenagers with shovels, an open manhole and the cold air rising from it, and the movement they noticed in the dark below the pavement. The rope lowered and the animal rising, slow and heavy, into the gray winter light. The newspaper paragraph the next morning, brief and unremarkable in its tone, sandwiched between other columns of city news in the way that the city was always generating news faster than it could quite be categorized. The snow shovel resting against a brownstone stoop while its owner leans over the manhole. The manhole cover set into the white-dusted asphalt a few feet away, displaced from its proper position by whatever combination of circumstances had left the opening exposed. The sound of the shovels that had been scraping the pavement and then stopped, leaving a silence above the street into which the much older sound of water moving through underground channels could, if the listener was attentive enough and the morning was quiet enough, just barely be heard. The 1935 incident is the kind of event that could only have happened in a particular city at a particular historical moment, the confluence of a specific infrastructure, a specific commercial practice, a specific cold winter morning, and a specific group of people who happened to be in the right place on the right block at the right time. It could not have happened in a city without a system of underground tunnels, accessible from street level. It could not have happened without the mail order and novelty trade that had been delivering live alligators to northern city apartments for several years before the morning in question. It could not have happened without the cold that had brought the teenagers out with their shovels, which is to say, without the specific northern climate that makes New York City so inhospitable to the animals its residents were nonetheless acquiring in considerable numbers. The irony of that last point is one of the quieter, interesting features of the whole story. The very climate that made New York a difficult long-term environment for alligators, cold winters, temperatures that would be genuinely dangerous for a reptile without access to basking sites and adequate warmth, was part of what concentrated the animals in the underground infrastructure in the first place. The sewer system, with its stable temperatures and its channels of moving water, offered something closer to survival conditions than the surface of a February street in East Harlem. The animals were not thriving in the sewers, in all likelihood, but they may have been managing, at least briefly, in the way that animals pushed beyond their natural range sometimes manage, holding on in conditions that are inadequate, but marginally less inadequate than the alternatives. And then the rope, and the February light, and the newspaper paragraph, and the story that has been growing in the city's collective memory ever since. What makes the 1935 account feel like a beginning, rather than an isolated incident, is the decade it happened in. The 1930s were the years when the baby alligator trade was producing its greatest volume of animals, when the novelty pet industry was operating without the regulatory constraints that would eventually limit it, when the gap between what people purchased impulsively and what they could realistically sustain in a city apartment was generating a quiet but consistent flow of released and abandoned animals into the city's infrastructure. The East Harlem incident of February 1935 is the most richly documented moment of that period, the one with a specific date and a specific street address and a newspaper record attached to it. But it was almost certainly not the only such moment. It was simply the one that the record caught. Somewhere in the same period, in a building in some part of the city, a cardboard box was arriving. The address on the outside was a New York City apartment address. The contents were alive and had been alive for the duration of the journey from Florida, and were now waiting in the dark of the box for whatever came next. The person who had ordered it, who had seen the advertisement in a magazine or a catalog or a shop window, who had sent away the $1 or $2, who had waited through the transit time that the postal system required, was about to lift the flap and look inside. The animal in the box was approximately 9 inches long. Its scales were already fully formed, dark and faintly iridescent in good light. Its eyes were already the particular amber gold of an alligator's eyes, already equipped to function in conditions of low illumination, already calibrated to the slow, patient rhythms of a creature that had been shaped by a very long evolutionary history in warm, shallow, slow-moving water. It had no particular investment in the city it had been shipped to. It had no awareness of how far it was from the conditions it was biologically suited for. It was simply alive, in a box, at a city address, waiting. How many such boxes were opened in New York during those years? In the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, is a question the record cannot fully answer. The dime stores kept no logs that have survived in accessible archives. The mail order companies did not publish their customer lists. The individual residents of individual apartments in individual boroughs left no documentation of the novelty pets they acquired, and eventually had to give up. What the record does preserve is the scattered, matter-of-fact evidence of the outcomes, the newspaper accounts, the captured strays, the occasional very large animal hauled through an open manhole on a February morning by a group of teenagers with a rope and the practical good sense to use it, the box and the animal inside it, and the moment of opening, that is where the legend begins, in the most concrete and material sense. Everything else that grew from it, the Teddy May account and the newspaper record, and the decades of storytelling that followed, grew from the particular combination of commerce and climate and city infrastructure that made it normal, for a time, for New York residents to receive live alligators in the mail. The city provided the infrastructure, the novelty trade provided the animals, and the cold northern winters, so thoroughly unsuited to anything the animals required, provided in the slow accumulation of released and abandoned hatchlings, finding their way into the warmer channels underground, the conditions from which the story of the sewer alligator was assembled, piece by piece, over the long decades of its telling. An adult alligator on a riverbank weighs as much as a large piece of furniture, and its body meets the ground with that particular solidity, not the tense stillness of an animal about to move, but the settled, patient heaviness of something that has been lying in exactly this place for a long time and intends to continue lying here for a long time more. The mud beneath it holds the impression of its belly and the underside of its tail. Its chest rises and falls in a rhythm so slow and measured that watching it for a few minutes in the warm morning light at the edge of a southern river, it becomes possible to lose count of how many breaths have passed. The scoots along its back are dark and wet from the water it left a short while ago. Each one is a small, slightly raised plate of skin reinforced with bone beneath, and across the animal's full length they form an interlocking surface that is neither rigid nor soft, but something in between, flexible enough to allow movement, dense enough to offer real protection. The texture is not smooth. Up close, each scoot has a rough quality to it, a slight graininess, and the edges where one plate meets the next are precise. The whole surface of the animal's back, in good light, has the look of something made rather than grown, which is part of what makes it so visually arresting, though the process that produced it is simply the same process that has been producing it, in one form or another, for an extremely long time. American alligators have been present on this continent, in forms closely resembling their current one, for somewhere in the range of 8 million years. The species has outlasted a great many things. The body plan that works for an alligator today is in its essential architecture the body plan that was working when the animal's predecessors were navigating a world that would be unrecognizable to any observer alive now. That kind of persistence tends to belong to animals whose fundamental design has arrived at something close to correct for the conditions they inhabit. Not perfect, not incapable of change, but deeply well matched to a particular way of living in a particular kind of world. The body of a fully grown male American alligator typically falls somewhere between 10 and 15 feet in length. The largest reliably documented individuals have approached 19 feet, though animals of that size are rare and represent the far end of a wide distribution. Weight in mature males generally ranges from 500 to roughly 1,000 pounds, with the heavier animals tending to be older animals. Alligators continue growing throughout their lives, which can extend across several decades in the wild, and longer still in managed settings. Females are considerably smaller, typically reaching 6 to 10 feet and weighing substantially less, a difference that reflects the species' mating dynamics and the different energetic demands the two sexes face across a long life. The jaw of an adult alligator contains between 74 and 80 conical teeth at any given moment, though that number is somewhat misleading as a static description. The teeth are not fixed. They are replaced continuously throughout the animal's lifetime, with new teeth developing in sockets beneath the existing ones and pushing up to replace those that are lost or worn through use. An alligator may go through as many as 3,000 teeth across its lifetime, which means that the jaw seen on any particular animal is not the jaw it was born with, but a current version of something that has been replacing itself over and over for as many years as the animal has been alive. Each tooth is conical and pointed, suited more to gripping and holding than to the slicing or grinding functions seen in mammals, which reflects something important about how the animal processes its food, by holding and, when necessary, by rotating in the water to tear sections free, a technique that uses the whole body rather than just the jaw. The skull itself is broad and long, flattened across its upper surface, with the eyes set high and the nostrils at the very tip of the snout. This arrangement is not accidental. With the body submerged, an alligator can keep both eyes and nostrils above the waterline, with almost nothing else visible, allowing it to monitor the surface of the water and breathe at the same time while revealing almost nothing of itself. The profile that appears above the surface in this posture, two small elevated eyes, a narrow ridge of skull, and a pair of nostrils at the end of a long flat snout, is minimal. It is exactly as much as the animal needs to expose, and no more. The eyes of an alligator have a vertical slit pupil that closes to a narrow line in bright daylight and opens wide in darkness, and they contain a structure behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer that amplifies available light and gives the eye its capacity to function in conditions where very little light is present. This is the same structure responsible for the eyeshine seen in cats and many nocturnal mammals, and in alligators it produces a distinctive red-orange glow when caught by a beam of light in the dark. Hunters and researchers have used this characteristic for generations to locate alligators at night, scanning the surface of a dark lake with a flashlight and looking for the points of reflected color among the reeds. On a warm night in the right habitat, there may be dozens of them visible at once, small paired reflections at water level, each one marking an animal that is watching the light from the still dark of the water. Alligators are ectothermic. The word describes an animal whose body temperature is determined primarily by the temperature of its surroundings rather than by internal heat generation, and it is one of the most consequential facts about how an alligator exists in the world. A warm-blooded animal, a bird, a mammal, carries its thermal environment with it. Its metabolism generates heat, regardless of the season, and within a range of external conditions, the animal's core temperature stays relatively stable. An alligator does not work this way. Its internal temperature tracks the temperature of the air and water around it, and as that temperature rises or falls, so does essentially everything about the animal's internal functioning. The range in which an alligator operates most effectively, moving, feeding, digesting, engaging with other animals, falls roughly between 82 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Within that band, the animal is alert and capable. Its metabolism runs at something close to its full rate. Digestion proceeds at a reasonable pace. Movement is fluid and responsive. Below that range, things begin to shift. As temperature drops towards 60 degrees Fahrenheit, an alligator's metabolism slows measurably. its capacity for sustained movement decreases. The urgency it brings to feeding diminishes. The whole pace of its internal life steps down in proportion to the cooling of the world around it. Below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the change becomes significant. The animal's behavior shifts toward a state that might look, from the outside, like profound inactivity, long periods of stillness, minimal response to external stimulation, a metabolic rate reduced to a fraction of what it is in warm weather. This state, which biologists refer to as brumation, is the reptilian equivalent of the hibernation seen in some mammals, though the two processes differ in important ways. In brumation, the animal does not become completely insensible. Its body temperature continues to follow the temperature of its environment. It can rouse and move if conditions require it. But under normal winter conditions in a temperate climate, it will spend weeks or months nearly motionless, often resting on the bottom of a pond or slow-moving stream, or lying in a shallow depression in a riverbank, its body's requirements reduced to something very close to zero. What an alligator in brumation requires from the world is almost nothing. It does not feed. Its breathing slows to the point where hours may pass between breaths when the animal is fully submerged. The heart rate drops. The body asks very little of itself, and in doing so, it can stretch the resources it carries through a long cold period in which those resources cannot be replenished. This quality, the ability to become for a season almost entirely self-contained, is one of the features that has made the alligator's basic design so persistent. The cold that would kill a mammal of equivalent size is something an alligator can simply wait out, sitting still in the cold mud, breathing once every few hours, needing almost nothing until the water around it begins to warm again. The limits of cold tolerance are real, however. Prolonged exposure to temperatures near freezing is typically fatal to alligators. An animal caught in a hard freeze, with no access to deeper or warmer water, and with temperatures remaining below freezing for extended periods, will not survive. The adaptation to cold is a slowdown, not an immunity. There are documented cases of alligators in the northern reaches of their range dying during severe cold snaps, when temperatures dropped rapidly and remained low long enough to overwhelm even a deeply brumating animal. The species range in the eastern United States reflects this constraint. Alligators occupy the warmer coastal plain states, with their northern distribution running through North Carolina, and they are not naturally found in genuinely cold climates. There is a behavior documented in alligators living in shallow ponds in their northern range that has drawn considerable attention from naturalists and wildlife biologists since it was first described in any systematic way. When an early freeze catches an animal in water too shallow to keep its body entirely submerged and away from freezing temperatures, the alligator has been observed positioning itself with its snout angled upward toward the surface before the water freezes solid above it, remaining in this posture as the freeze sets in around its body, leaving only the tip of its snout projecting through the ice into the air above. The animal enters brumation in this position and can remain in it for as long as the freeze holds, breathing through the small opening maintained by the presence of its own snout, motionless and locked in place by the ice but alive. When the thaw comes, it simply swims free. The behavior has a particular quality to it, not the urgency of something trying to escape a trap, but the settled patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has no particular objection to doing it again. The skin of an alligator is one of the more structurally complex surfaces in the vertebrate world. The scutes on the back contain osteoderms, small deposits of bone embedded within the skin itself, which give the dorsal surface a genuine armoring quality. The belly, by contrast, is much softer, lacking the bony reinforcement of the back and covered in smoother, more flexible scales. This difference reflects the different demands placed on each surface. The back is exposed to the world and benefits from protection, while the belly typically rests against mud or water and requires flexibility more than armor. The whole outer surface of the animal is keratinized, the same general class of protein that forms human fingernails and the outer layer of human skin, though in a considerably denser and more structured arrangement. Distributed across the surface of the jaw and across much of the body are small dome-shaped structures called integumentary sense organs. Each one sits in a small pit in a scale and is connected to sensory nerve fibers below. These organs are pressure receptors, capable of detecting minute variations in the mechanical environment immediately surrounding the animal, tiny pressure waves in the water, small vibrations traveling through the surface, disturbances of a kind that would be invisible to any visual sense. In the dark water of a swamp at night, when nothing can be seen, these receptors provide an ongoing picture of what is moving nearby. A fish disturbing the water 10 feet away creates a pressure pattern that reaches the animal's jaw and body and is registered by these small, precise instruments. The information they provide is not visual and not auditory in the conventional sense. It is something closer to a felt map of the immediate environment, a sense of the water's texture and how that texture is changing moment to moment. The integumentary sense organs also respond to changes in surface tension when the animal rests at the waterline, which may help it detect animals moving on the water's surface, or animals near the bank whose footsteps send small vibrations through the ground and into the water. The full range of information these structures provide is still being studied, and what is understood about them represents only part of a sensory picture that is genuinely different from the sensory picture available to a mammal. An alligator in dark water is not a blind, disoriented animal fumbling through an environment it cannot perceive. It is an animal in full sensory contact with a great deal of information about its surroundings, processed through organs and nervous systems that have been refined over millions of years to work in exactly this kind of environment. The hearing of an alligator operates across a frequency range that overlaps considerably with human hearing, and the animals are capable of producing and responding to a range of vocalizations. Hatchlings and young alligators produce high-pitched calls, a sound sometimes described as a rapid, repetitive grunt that draw the attention of the mother and of other adults who will respond to them, and in the mother's case, provide a degree of protection in the period immediately after hatching. Adult alligators produce deeper bellowing vocalizations, particularly during the breeding season in late spring, and these sounds carry a considerable distance across open water. A full bellowing call from a large adult male on a still morning, heard from a distance, is a low, rolling, resonant sound that travels through the chest as much as the ears. The vision of an alligator is adapted for a specific kind of work. The eyes, set high on the skull and protected by a transparent third eyelid, a nictitating membrane that closes horizontally across the eye when the animal submerges, provide good vision in low light conditions. Color perception exists, but is different from human color vision, weighted toward the lower end of the light spectrum. At the surface of the water in daylight, an alligator's field of view is wide, the elevated eye position providing a broad view of the surrounding environment. Underwater, the nictitating membrane reduces visual acuity somewhat, but the integumentary sense organs take on a larger role in building the animal's picture of what is nearby. A hatchling alligator emerges from its egg at approximately 9 inches in length, a miniature version of the adult in all its essential features. the scutes already formed and precise, the jaw already containing functional teeth, the eyes already positioned to watch the world from close to the waterline. The first weeks and months of a young alligator's life are spent in close association with the mother and with the other hatchlings from the same clutch. The animals in a single clutch form a loose group called a pod and remain together for a period that may extend across the first year or more of their lives, foraging together in shallow water and retreating together when threatened. Growth in young alligators is tied closely to conditions. A hatchling raised in warm, food-rich water in a southern state, in the shallow, slow-moving lakes and river backwaters of Florida or Louisiana, where insects, small fish, and aquatic invertebrates are abundant, may reach 6 feet in length within 6 to 10 years. The same animal placed in colder water with limited food would grow far more slowly, its body putting available resources into maintenance rather than growth. Its length at the end of 10 years, a fraction of what it might have been in better conditions. Growth rate, in other words, is not simply a fixed property of the species, it is a product of what the environment provides, and environments vary enormously. Feeding in adult alligators is opportunistic and wide-ranging. Fish, turtles, birds, small mammals, and occasionally larger prey all fall within the diet of a healthy adult in its natural habitat. The feeding technique involves patience and position more than pursuit. The animal rests at or near the surface, in the water or at its edge, and waits for prey to come within range. The strike, when it comes, is fast. The jaw closes with considerable force. Bite force measurements in large alligators have reached several thousand pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded for any living animal, and prey is gripped, drowned if necessary, and then consumed in sections. Digestion afterward is slow, proceeding over days rather than hours, and a large meal can sustain an adult alligator for an extended period. This is part of what makes the species so well suited to environments where food availability varies seasonally. The ability to eat a great deal when food is present, and then draw on stored energy for weeks or months when it is not. The stomach of an alligator is muscular and powerful, capable of processing hard materials, bone, shell, cartilage, that would be indigestible to many other predators. Alligators are also known to swallow stones, which are thought to act as gastroliths, ballast, and grinding material that may help break down harder food items in the stomach. The presence of stones in an alligator's stomach has been documented consistently enough across different populations and conditions to suggest it is a regular part of the animal's digestive strategy rather than an incidental behavior. The reproductive biology of American alligators involves a nesting season that runs through late spring and summer, with females constructing mound nests from vegetation and organic debris at the water's edge. The mound, which can reach 3 or more feet in height and several feet across, serves as both a container for the eggs and a heat source. The decomposition of the organic material inside it generates warmth that supplements whatever heat comes from the sun. The female guards the nest through the incubation period, which lasts approximately 60 to 65 days. She responds to the calls of hatching young by opening the nest and assisting hatchlings in reaching the water, and she may carry them to the water's edge in her mouth, a behavior that looks from the outside incongruous in an animal whose jaw is capable of the forces described earlier, but which is executed with a gentleness that has been well documented in wildlife observations and camera footage from across the species range. The sex of alligator hatchlings is not determined by genetics in the way it is in mammals and birds. It is determined by the temperature experienced by the developing eggs during a critical window in the middle portion of incubation. Eggs incubated at temperatures around 93 degrees Fahrenheit tend to produce males. Eggs incubated at lower temperatures, around 86 degrees Fahrenheit, tend to produce females. The temperature inside a nest depends on its position, the amount of sun it receives, the composition of the vegetative material it is built from, and the year's particular weather patterns, all of which can vary, producing clutches of mixed sex ratios and making the species' overall population composition responsive to long-term shifts in the climate of its habitat. This sensitivity to temperature at the developmental stage connects the species in a direct and measurable way to the thermal conditions of the environment across decades and generations. The population of American alligators in the United States was significantly reduced through much of the 20th century by hunting and habitat loss, and by the 1960s the species had been placed under federal protection as an endangered species. The recovery that followed has been one of the more notable wildlife conservation outcomes in North American history. By the 1980s, populations had rebounded to the point where the species was removed from the endangered list. Current estimates place the total American alligator population in the wild at somewhere between 1 and 5 million animals, distributed across the coastal plain states from Texas to North Carolina, with Florida and Louisiana holding the largest populations. The animal that seemed in genuine danger of disappearing within living memory now occupies its historical range in numbers large enough to support regulated hunting seasons in several states. There are places in the southern United States where encountering an alligator in the course of ordinary daily life, crossing a golf course at dusk, walking a path beside a retention pond, pulling into a parking lot near a lake, is not unusual. The species has adapted to modified and semi-urban landscapes with a flexibility that surprises people who think of it purely as a wilderness animal. Retention ponds and drainage canals, golf course water features, the weedy edges of suburban lakes. These environments, whatever else they may lack, offer the shallow, warm water, the sun exposure, and the food resources that an alligator needs to function. Animals have been found in swimming pools, in parking garages adjacent to waterways, and in the lobbies of waterfront properties in Florida. They move overland more readily than most people expect, covering considerable distances between water bodies, particularly during the breeding season, when males in particular range widely in search of territories and mates. The range of temperatures across which the American alligator's geographic distribution falls is precise and relevant to understanding the animal's constraints. In the northernmost parts of its range, the coastal areas of North Carolina, winter temperatures are cold enough that alligators spend significant portions of the year in brumation, and their populations are smaller and less dense than those found further south. As the climate moves toward Florida and Louisiana, the season available to an active alligator grows longer, the range of warm months expands, and the populations thicken accordingly. The animal is, in a fundamental way, a creature of warmth, not merely comfortable in it, but dependent on it for everything the word active covers. The metabolic efficiency of an ectothermic predator is in one respect remarkable. A large alligator requires a fraction of the food that a mammal of equivalent mass would need to sustain itself, because it is not running an internal furnace, it is not generating heat. The food it consumes goes to growth, repair, and the energy of movement, rather than to the constant metabolic work of maintaining a stable internal temperature against the pull of a colder environment. This efficiency means that an alligator can exist in environments where food is relatively sparse without starving as quickly as a comparably sized warm-blooded predator would. The cost of that efficiency is dependence on the external environment for the heat that drives the metabolism at all, but in the right environment, The trade-off is one the animal's long history suggests has been working adequately for a very long time. The eyes of an alligator in full brumation are open or partially open, which sometimes creates the impression in observers who encounter a wintering alligator that the animal is alert and watching when it is, in physiological terms, doing something closer to the opposite. The open eye in a brumating alligator is not an eye that is processing information in the way it would be in an active animal. The nervous system has slowed with everything else. The animal is present in its body in a way that is different from either sleep or full wakefulness. A third kind of state, something the language of mammalian consciousness does not map onto. Well, which is part of why descriptions of it tend to reach for analogies rather than precise terms. What the brumating alligator does in winter at the bottom of a shallow pond or tucked into the bank of a slow-moving river is something that is difficult to find an equivalent for in the experience of any warm-blooded animal. The whole body has stepped back from the demands of existing. The heart moves blood slowly through the body at a reduced rate. The lungs inflate and deflate at intervals that, measured against a mammalian rhythm, are impossibly long. The animal is not waiting exactly, because waiting implies an awareness of the thing being waited for. It is simply present in its own body, in a greatly reduced form, the living process reduced to its minimum sufficient requirements, held there by the cold of the water around it, and released again, gradually, as the water warms with the returning season. It is this quality, the capacity for patient, minimally demanding existence through long, cold stretches of time, that sits at the center of what an alligator is, in biological terms, more than the jaw force, or the sensory organs, or the self-replacing teeth, remarkable as each of those things is in its own right. The animal carries a deep architectural patience into everything it does. It is built from its temperature-dependent metabolism to its slow, fuel-efficient digestion for the long view. It does not hurry. It does not need to. The design that has been arriving at something close to correct for 8 million years does not have any obvious reason to hurry, and sitting with a large alligator on a warm riverbank in the morning light, watching the slow rise and fall of its chest against the mud, it is possible to feel something of that time, the long, quiet accumulation of a design that simply kept working, season after season, across a span of years, that resists any ordinary sense of scale. And then winter comes, as it always does, and the water begins to cool, and the animal moves to the shallows and grows slower, and slower still, until at last it rests nearly motionless in the cold mud, with only its nostrils breaking the surface of the water, two small dark openings, barely visible, letting in the cold air of a winter morning, as the rest of the animal rests in the dark beneath the still and quiet surface, breathing once and then again, separated by a long and unhurried interval, the whole living body carrying its warmth inward and holding it there through the months of cold, patient and complete, containing in that single barely visible detail everything that the design has learned about lasting. The smell reaches you before anything else does. Standing at the rim of an open manhole on a New York City street, the air rising from below carries something warm and mineral and alive, a breath of underground, of water moving through old stone, of a city conducting its necessary business in the dark beneath the asphalt. The sound comes up with it, a low, continuous murmur, water finding its way through brick tunnels laid in patterns that have not changed in 150 years. The city's oldest infrastructure still working quietly beneath its newest surfaces. That opening in the pavement is the entry point to something most people pass over several times a day without considering what lies beneath. The round iron cover, set flush with the street, is one of roughly 300,000 such covers distributed across New York City's 5 boroughs. Each one is a hatch above a system so large that if its pipes and tunnels were laid end to end, they would reach from New York to Los Angeles and back again, with several hundred miles left over. New York City's sewer system encompasses approximately 7,500 miles of sewer lines. 14 wastewater treatment plants receive what those lines carry and process it, collectively handling more than 3 billion gallons of wastewater every single day. The pipes range in diameter from the modest 12-inch lines running beneath residential streets to the enormous trunk sewers beneath the avenues, tunnels large enough to stand inside, large enough to walk through, large enough to carry away the combined biological and domestic output of more than 8 million people going about their daily lives above. Some of what lies down there is not old, exactly, but some of it is genuinely ancient by the standards of a working city. Brooklyn's earliest brick-lined underground sewers were constructed in the 1850s, laid by hand in the old method, each brick placed and mortared by workers who had come from across the Atlantic to build a city they would mostly live in without ever becoming famous. Those mid-19th century structures, or portions of them, continue to function. Water passes through arches built before the American Civil War, and the city has grown above them in layers: gas lines, water mains, electrical conduits, subway tunnels, the layered deposits of more than a century and a half of underground construction. And beneath all of it, the original brick sewers still carry what they were built to carry. The system is not a single thing. It is a network of networks, an accumulation of decisions made across different decades by different engineers with different tools and different ideas about how a city's body should function. Walking through the oldest sections, which occasional maintenance workers and urban historians have documented in photographs and written accounts, is something like moving through geological time. Each change in the brickwork or the pipe material or the tunnel diameter marks a different era of the city's underground expansion, a different generation of problem solvers deciding what to do with the water that falls on the surface and the waste that accumulates beneath it. The temperature inside this system is one of its most distinctive and least known qualities. Standing above ground in Manhattan in January, a person encounters temperatures that regularly fall well below freezing, the wind carrying the cold in off the water and between the buildings until the air feels genuinely hostile. Descend through a manhole, and that seasonal drama disappears almost immediately. The interior temperature of New York City's sewer tunnels remains relatively stable throughout the year, generally ranging between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on depth and location, because the surrounding soil and the thermal mass of the earth insulate the tunnels against the dramatic swings experienced at the surface. The mechanism behind this stability is the same one that makes caves in temperate regions remain at a roughly constant temperature year-round. The Earth is a very large object with a very large capacity to absorb and hold heat, and the deeper below the surface a space sits, the more completely it is insulated from the short-cycle thermal variations happening above. A sewer tunnel 10 feet below a New York City street is not in contact with the winter air. It is in contact with the earth, which adjusts slowly over seasons and years, not over hours and days. The result is an environment that is cool in summer and relatively mild in winter, perpetually temperate in the way that underground spaces tend to be, occupying a thermal middle ground that has nothing to do with what is happening in the world above. This stability has consequences for what can live there. Not everything that exists in the underground environment of a working sewer system does so because anyone planned or intended it. Most of it arrived by accident or through the ordinary processes of dispersal and opportunism that characterize biological communities, wherever food and shelter happen to coincide. The organisms most reliably documented to inhabit urban sewer systems form a particular and well-studied community. Bacteria are present throughout, in numbers and varieties that would be difficult to comprehend without a microscope and several hours of laboratory work. Fungi colonize the organic material that accumulates on pipe walls and in slower moving sections of the system. Flies whose larvae thrive in the same organic deposits have been found in essentially every urban sewer system that has been formally studied. And then there are the rats. The brown rat, known formally as Rattus norvegicus and informally by a number of unflattering names, is found in virtually every major urban sewer system worldwide. Its relationship with human infrastructure predates its relationship with New York, specifically. The species originated in Central Asia, spread westward through Europe across several centuries of grain trade and sea commerce, arrived in North America aboard ships in the 18th century, and has been a resident of New York's underground spaces since well before the current sewer system existed. It did not colonize the city because the sewer system was built for it. It colonized the sewer system because the sewer system, once built, turned out to offer exactly what the brown rat has always required: food, warmth, shelter from predators, and darkness in which to move without being seen. A brown rat navigating a large sewer tunnel moves with the specific confidence of an animal that has spent its entire species history learning the geometry of enclosed spaces. It runs along ledges above the flowing water. It knows the locations of food sources, the positions of its competitors, the exits to the surface, and the temperature gradients that indicate where the warmest resting places can be found. Its whiskers register airflow and texture simultaneously. Its claws find purchase on wet brick without visible effort. The tunnel, which to a human eye appears inhospitable and disorienting, registers to the rat as a detailed, familiar, navigable world. The rat population in New York City's underground spaces is large and has never been precisely counted. Estimates have varied enormously over the years, from the romantically exaggerated to the statistically careful, and the careful ones still arrive at numbers that are difficult to hold in the mind without some effort. What is known with reasonable confidence is that wherever the city has food, warmth, and cover, rats are present, and the sewer system offers all three with considerable generosity. The system provides not just a living space, but a highway, a network of connected tunnels and pipes that allows a rat to move across large distances beneath the surface of the city without ever exposing itself to the open air. The people who built this system and who have maintained it across the century and a half of its existence represent their own distinct chapter in the underground history of New York. They are known as sandhogs, a name that requires a brief explanation. The term originated not in the sewer tunnels specifically, but in the work of digging beneath the Hudson River, where the sandy, wet, unstable substrate encountered by early tunnel workers made their job particularly demanding, and where the word eventually came to name not just that particular category of work, but the broader culture of underground construction in the city. Sandhogs built the subway tunnels, and the water tunnels, and the rail connections, and sandhogs built and maintained the sewers. And across more than 100 years of underground work in New York, the occupation passed from generation to generation within a set of immigrant families and their descendants, transmitted as a trade, a knowledge base, a set of skills, and a culture of mutual support. The knowledge a sandhog carries is not easily described in general terms because it is so specific to the underground conditions of this particular city. A person who has spent years working in the sewer tunnels beneath Lower Manhattan knows what the soil layers look and smell and behave like at different depths, knows where the water table rises and where it drops, knows the sounds that indicate a stable tunnel wall and the sounds that indicate something shifting. This is practical knowledge, the kind built through direct and repeated physical experience, and it does not transfer easily to someone who has only read about it. The first time a new worker descends into a large sewer tunnel, they are generally accompanied by someone for whom the environment is as familiar as a kitchen, someone for whom the brick arch overhead and the moving water below and the smell of the atmosphere and the particular quality of the silence are all simply the ordinary conditions of the working day. The working conditions in active sewer tunnels are worth understanding clearly, not because they are dramatic, but because they are specific and unusual in ways that matter for thinking about what the underground environment can actually support. Hydrogen sulfide is present in active sewage-carrying tunnels as a byproduct of bacterial decomposition. It is a gas with a noticeable odor, the smell associated with sulfur, but its danger is not primarily in the smell, which the nose actually becomes less sensitive to after brief exposure. At higher concentrations, it is a serious respiratory hazard, and workers who enter active sewer spaces carry gas detectors as a matter of standard practice. Methane is also present, produced by the same microbial processes, and the combination of methane and the occasional spark from tools or equipment has been a concern throughout the history of underground maintenance work. The air in an active sewer tunnel is not the same air that moves through the streets above. It is chemically distinct from the atmosphere at the surface, enriched with gases that the biological processes of decomposition produce, and stripped of some of the oxygen that those same processes consume. Workers manage this through ventilation, fresh air pumped in through hoses and blowers before a crew descends, and through the monitoring equipment that each worker carries, and that sounds an alarm if the composition of the air shifts towards something dangerous. This is not an environment, in other words, where air quality can be taken for granted. It requires active management, and that active management is itself part of the work. The maintenance of the system is constant and largely invisible. Sewer workers descend into the tunnels on scheduled inspection cycles, checking for structural damage, blockages, and the slow deterioration that comes from a century or more of water, microbial activity, and the mechanical stress of settling soil above. In the oldest sections, inspection findings are sometimes matters of historical interest as much as engineering concern. A Victorian-era brick arch that has settled slightly in its foundations, the mortar between the bricks aged and replaced, and aged again across several generations of maintenance work. The arch still functional, but carrying in its materials and its geometry the specific decisions made by engineers who are long dead. Larger repair and replacement projects require sections of the tunnel network to be taken offline, the flow of water diverted through alternative routes while crews work in the emptied section. In those moments, the oldest parts of the system become fully visible. The exact brickwork, the profile of the arch, the slope of the floor, the positions of the junction points where smaller lines feed into larger ones. Engineers and historians who have documented these spaces describe a quality of quiet that is different from the quiet of the surface, a stillness that comes partly from the insulation of the surrounding earth and partly from the removal of all the ambient sounds that fill ordinary city life. The traffic, the voices, the machinery, the low constant noise of millions of people living at close range. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the system was being substantially expanded to keep pace with the city's rapid growth, the pace of construction underground was extraordinary by any modern standard. Workers dug by hand and with the early mechanical tools available at the time in conditions that were difficult even by the demanding standards of construction work generally. The accounts left by workers and supervisors from those periods describe shifts of tremendous physical labor, the incremental extension of tunnels through soil and rock, and the occasional obstacle, an unexpected water main, a buried foundation from an earlier structure, a geological irregularity that had not shown up on any map. The population of the city grew faster than the infrastructure could always comfortably absorb. The sewer system was expanded in response to growth, planned in advance of growth, and occasionally overwhelmed by growth that arrived faster than plans could accommodate. The result accumulated over more than a century is a system that reflects its own history in its physical structure, the older brick-lined tunnels in the older neighborhoods, the newer concrete and engineered pipe systems in areas built or rebuilt in later decades, the junction points where different generations of construction meet, and where the materials and methods shift noticeably from one type to another. Water moves through this system by gravity, in most sections, directed by the slope of the pipes and the accumulated design decisions of more than a century of engineering. In relatively flat areas of the city, the slope available is small and the movement of water is slow. In areas with more topographic variation, the slope is steeper and the flow is correspondingly more energetic. In periods of heavy rain, the system receives surface runoff in addition to the ordinary volume of wastewater, and in older sections where stormwater and sewage flow through the same pipes, combined sewer systems, which were the standard design in the 19th century, heavy rainfall can produce surges that move through the tunnels with significant force. Those surge events are part of the reason that maintenance inspections are conducted between rain events rather than during them. The difference between the quiet, navigable environment of a dry weather inspection and the same tunnel during a surge event is substantial. Water that moves slowly enough to walk beside during dry conditions can rise and accelerate during heavy rain to something that would make a person's footing genuinely uncertain. The tunnels are designed to handle these loads, and for the most part they do, though the oldest sections of the system require careful monitoring for signs that their capacity is being tested. The city's 14 wastewater treatment plants represent the end point of this journey, the place where what enters the sewer system as wastewater exits as something that can be returned to the environment without causing significant harm. The plants are large industrial facilities operating continuously and processing an amount of wastewater each day that is genuinely difficult to visualize without some kind of concrete reference. 1,300,000,000 gallons is a quantity without an intuitive household analog. It is, to offer one approach to the scale, roughly the volume of water in about 2,000 Olympic swimming pools, processed every day of the year, regardless of weather, holiday, or any other variable. The circular settling tanks at a wastewater treatment plant, seen at night from a distance, have a particular quality, still and reflective on the surface, the water moving through the treatment process in a slow and deliberate way that the gentle rotation of the surface machinery barely disturbs. The plants sit at the edges of the city, close to the water bodies into which the treated effluent is discharged, and their operations are regulated and monitored continuously by both internal and external agencies concerned with the quality of the harbor and the rivers and the ocean that receive what the city sends out. The ecological condition of New York Harbor and the rivers that flow into it has improved substantially over the past several decades in part because of the improved performance of those treatment plants and the regulatory framework that governs them. Striped bass, harbor seals, dolphins, and other species have returned to waters that were once too degraded to support them, a development that reflects the functioning of the treatment infrastructure in a way that residents of the city rarely have occasion to consider directly. The people who monitor and operate those plants and the sewer system that feeds them work on schedules that have no relationship to the clock the rest of the city runs on. Sewage is produced at all hours, rain falls at all hours, treatment is continuous, and the workers who maintain its continuity move through the system at night and on weekends and on holidays, carrying their gas detectors and their inspection records and the accumulated practical knowledge of an occupation that has been passed down through generations of workers who understood the underground city well enough to keep it running without anyone above the surface needing to think about it. The physical presence of the system beneath the streets of New York is something that most residents understand only abstractly, if at all. The clues to its existence are the round iron covers set into the pavement, the occasional sounds of water moving beneath a quiet section of sidewalk, the steam that rises from grates in certain weather conditions, the maintenance crews who descend with their equipment and their safety checks and then come back up again, carrying out of the tunnel something learned or fixed or documented that will not appear in the public record in any form most people will ever encounter. What sits beneath a New York City block, if the earth were made transparent and the layers of infrastructure made visible simultaneously, is a kind of accidental vertical archaeology. Subway tunnels at the deepest level, then water mains and electrical conduits at intermediate depths, then the sewer lines closer to the surface, and above everything the buried foundations of the oldest buildings and the roots of the street trees pushing down through whatever soil remains between the infrastructure layers. No single engineer or planner ever sat down and designed this arrangement. It accumulated across more than 2 centuries of decisions, each one made in the context of what was already there, and the result is a kind of layered order that is neither random nor entirely intentional, a structure that reflects the city's history as clearly as any surface feature does. A maintenance worker descending into a brick-lined Victorian-era sewer tunnel somewhere beneath Lower Manhattan stands, in a certain sense, in the middle of that history. The arch above them was built by hands that have been dust for 100 years. The mortar between the bricks has been repaired so many times that no one portion of the original construction remains chemically identical to what was laid in the 1870s or 1880s. The water moving along the floor of the tunnel is entirely new water, continuous and always replaced. Only the shape persists, the precise geometry of the arch and the floor, and the junction points, the decisions made by engineers long dead, preserved in the arrangement of materials that continue to do what they were built to do. The water that moves through the tunnel at this moment carries what the city has produced today, not specifically or individually distinguishable, all of it combined and channeled and directed by gravity down the slope of the pipe toward the treatment plant. The movement is quiet and continuous. Above the tunnel, the city continues its surface life, traffic, voices, the sounds of construction, the particular noise of millions of people in proximity. And below, the water moves through the dark in the brick arch, steady and unremarkable, the same motion that has been happening in this tunnel since the century when it was built. The arch will still be carrying water, in all probability, 100 years from now. The maintenance schedules will continue. The workers will descend and document and repair and ascend. The treatment plants will process and discharge and monitor and adjust. The round iron covers in the pavement will continue to carry the weight of traffic above them without complaint, their particular function invisible to everyone who crosses them. There is something quietly notable about the age of the oldest sections, the fact that a structure laid by hand in the decade after the Civil War is still performing the function for which it was designed in a city that has changed almost entirely around it. The brick arch does not know it is old. It holds its shape because that is what well-built arches do. The water beneath it does not know it is inside something historic. It moves where gravity directs it, as water always does. And in that persistence in the brick arch still curving overhead, 150 years after the hands that placed it have been replaced by generations of descendants, there is something that the word infrastructure does not quite capture. The word suggests utility, function, the purely instrumental. What the oldest sections of the New York City sewer system actually represent, looked at from a certain angle, is something closer to a commitment, the kind that a city makes to its own future by building carefully enough that the future will not have to rebuild everything from the beginning. The smell of warm air rising from an open manhole on a quiet street carries that history with it. Though there is no separating its components by nose, it is simply the smell of the underground, the particular combination of old stone and moving water and the city's biological processes and the earth that surrounds it all, warm and alive in its own subterranean way, carrying a network of brick and pipe and work and accumulated knowledge that stretches in all directions beneath the surface of the city, mostly invisible, mostly unremarked, and mostly still doing exactly what it was built to do. Somewhere in the lower sections of the old system, in one of the brick-lined tunnels that dates back to the middle of the 19th century, water is moving right now through an arch that has been in continuous use for more than 150 years. The mortar holds. The bricks remain in their positions. The water finds the slope and follows it, as it has always done, as it will continue to do, down through the dark and toward the light at the far end of the system, where the city returns what it has taken to the water, and the water carries it out toward the harbor and the open sea beyond. Someone leaning across a kitchen table, their voice dropping just slightly, their posture changing in the way it does when the story they are about to tell is one they believe. The lamp above the table throws a warm circle of light. Outside, the street is ordinary, but the person leaning forward says, "A friend of mine who works underground told me something." That moment, that specific small adjustment of voice and body is where the sewer alligator lives, not in the sewers, not in any newspaper archive, not in any manhole on any numbered street in any borough of any city. The legend lives in the pause before the telling, and in the particular quality of attention that pause creates in the person sitting across the table. It is worth spending some time with that moment, because what happens there is not, as it might first appear, simply a matter of people repeating things that are not true. What happens there is something more interesting than that, and more revealing, and in its own quiet way, more durable than almost any fact that could be set against it. The study of stories like this one, stories that move through cities the way weather moves, touching different people in different years, changing slightly with each telling, surviving every attempt to disprove them, began in earnest with a book published in 1981. Jan Harold Brunvand was a folklorist at the University of Utah, and the book was called Asterisk, The Vanishing Hitchhiker Asterisk, after one of the stories it examined. The title refers to the well-known account of a driver who picks up a young woman on a rural road and discovers, after dropping her at a house she has named, that she died on that road years before. Brunvand had collected hundreds of versions of this story from dozens of American cities and towns. What interested him was not whether any individual version was true. What interested him was the pattern, the way the story moved, the structural features it kept across all its variations, the specific kind of truth it seemed to be pointing at, even when every factual detail was wrong. Brumvind coined the term urban legend for this category of story, and in doing so, he gave scholars a precise vocabulary for something people had been doing for as long as cities existed. An urban legend, in Brumvind's framework, is not simply a false rumor. It is a story that travels by word of mouth, that claims to be true or to be based on a true account, that carries some identifiable emotional or social content, and that survives because it addresses something real about the anxieties or curiosities of the people who tell it. The factual content may be wrong. The emotional content rarely is. The sewer alligator appears in Brunvand's work, and he gave it a classification that is worth understanding. He called it an ostensive legend. The word ostension comes from the Latin for pointing, and what Brunvand meant by an ostensive legend was one that occasionally generates real-world behavior in response to its own circulation. The story does not merely travel through the world, it acts on the world. People who hear that there are alligators in the sewers sometimes go looking. Maintenance workers, hearing the legend, sometimes report that they have seen something. The legend creates the conditions under which the legend can appear to be confirmed, and each apparent confirmation sends it further. This is a different category from a story that simply circulates without effect. The sewer alligator story has at various points in its history caused municipal officials to issue denials, caused journalists to file investigations, caused wildlife officers to conduct searches. The story has generated the kind of response that only real things ordinarily generate, and this response has in turn made the story seem more real. It is a loop, closed gently on itself, and the loop has been running for the better part of a century. Brumvand also paid careful attention to the structure of how such a story is transmitted. The sewer alligator story travels through a specific recurring form, one that appears in nearly every version of it, regardless of where or when it is told. The speaker always positions themselves at exactly 1 or 2 removes from a direct witness, not someone who saw the alligator themselves. That would be too easy to question. Instead, a friend of mine who works in the sewers, a cousin who knows someone on a maintenance crew, a neighbor whose brother-in-law works for the city. The account is always close enough to feel personal and immediate, and always just far enough away that it cannot be directly examined. Brunvand identified this structure as central to urban legend transmission generally. The positioning at 1 or 2 removes does several things at once. It lends the story the emotional weight of personal testimony without exposing any actual person to direct scrutiny. It places the witness in a credible location, underground, in the sewers, in the specific environment where the thing would have been seen, rather than somewhere implausible. And it creates a chain of trust. The person telling the story is vouching for the person who vouched for the person who saw the thing. Each link in the chain is an act of social trust, and to question the story too aggressively is in some small way to question the relationships it travels through. This structure is very old. It is essentially the structure of oral tradition generally, the account that reaches the listener through a named sequence of reliable people, each of whom stands in for direct verification. What makes it specifically urban is the particular credibility granted to the person who works underground. The sewer worker, the tunnel maintenance crew, the sandhog who spends his days in the infrastructure beneath the city. These are figures who inhabit a world that most people have no access to, and their testimony therefore carries a weight that cannot be easily checked. They have been below, they have seen what is there, and what they say about it reaches the surface already carrying the authority of the inaccessible. It is a persuasive structure, and it has moved the sewer alligator story through more than 8 decades of American life. But the story is not unique to America, and it is not unique to alligators. What emerges from a comparative look at urban legends across different countries is that the impulse behind the sewer alligator story, the impulse to populate hidden urban infrastructure with unexpected, large, and vaguely improbable animals, appears to be a widespread feature of modern city life, wherever modern cities exist. In London, which has its own dense and ancient underground infrastructure, the legends tend toward large catfish or eels in the buried tributaries of the city's old rivers, the Fleet, the Walbrook, the Effra, which now flow underground through Victorian brick tunnels on their way to the Thames. People who have worked in those tunnels have at various points over the past 100 years reported seeing large shapes moving in the dark water. No survey has confirmed a population of unusual fish, and the chemical and hydrological conditions of urban buried waterways are not particularly hospitable to large predatory species. But the stories persist with the same structural features as the New York sewer alligator, the credible underground witness, the story at one remove, the animal too large to be fully explained. In Tokyo, where the drainage infrastructure runs to an extraordinary depth and complexity beneath one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas on Earth, the legends sometimes involve unusual reptiles or large eels in the lower drainage systems. In Paris, whose underground is perhaps the most mythologized of any European city, partly because of its history of catacombs, partly because of the well-documented existence of its 19th century sewer tours, which were a genuine tourist attraction, the animal legends are joined by others involving human communities and lost artifacts and sealed rooms, the animal acting as one element in a broader mythology of what the underground contains. What this pattern across many cities and cultures suggests is that the sewer alligator is not really about alligators. The alligator is a vessel. Into it flows a very particular anxiety that modern cities generate almost as a byproduct of existing, the anxiety about what is underneath. Every large city built on the scale that modern cities are built sits atop an invisible counterpart, a second city of pipes and tunnels and infrastructure that almost no one ever sees and that most people never think about except when it fails. The water arrives at the tap, the waste disappears into the drain, the subway tunnels below the street, and the cable ducts below the subway, and the old brick sewers below those. The city extends downward into regions that its inhabitants cannot visit and have no map of and cannot easily imagine. And into that unmapped, uninspectable, genuinely unknown space, the urban imagination inserts animals, large animals, animals that would have been small and harmless when they were introduced, as pets, as novelties, as small harmless things, and have grown in the dark into something else entirely. The structural logic of the legend is the structural logic of the city itself. Things go in, they disappear below the surface, and they transform. The alligator that went down a drain as a small pet comes back up, in the legend, as a large, strange, potentially dangerous thing that has been changed by its time in the dark. It is almost impossible not to notice that this is also, loosely, the structural logic of a great deal of urban anxiety generally. Brunvand was attentive to this dimension of urban legends, and the best work in the tradition he established has continued to take it seriously. An urban legend is not simply wrong information that people have failed to correct. It is a story that a group of people keep telling because the story addresses something real, even when every factual element of the story is false. The factual errors are, in a sense, beside the point. What the story captures, the sense of the city as a place of hidden depths, of lost things that grow and change below the surface, of the infrastructure as a kind of dark mirror of the life conducted above it, is something that the people who tell it recognize as true to their experience of living in a modern city, even if no alligator has ever been below their street. This is what Brunvan's fieldwork kept revealing, across hundreds of legend types and thousands of collected variations, that the persistence of a false story is evidence of something real, not evidence of the specific fact the story asserts. Evidence of a genuine feeling, a genuine concern, a genuine feature of the world as the storytellers experience it. Understanding that dimension of the sewer alligator story does not require believing that the sewers contain alligators. It requires only a willingness to ask what the story would feel true about, even in the absence of the alligators themselves. The story entered literary culture at a precise and documentable moment. In 1963, Thomas Pynchon published his first novel, *V*, and among its several interwoven storylines was an extended sequence involving a character named Benny Profane, who earns money hunting albino alligators through the tunnels of the New York City sewer system at night. Profane descends into the sewers with a flashlight and a rifle, moving through the dark tunnels in search of animals that have grown large and pale in the underground dark, their color leached from them by years without sunlight. The sequence is written with the particular texture of urban myth. It reads as though it is based on something that actually happened, or that everyone has heard happened, even as the albino alligators push it clearly into the territory of the surreal. Pynchon was a young writer at the time, and the novel was taken seriously enough by the American literary establishment that it appeared on course reading lists and attracted the attention of serious critics almost immediately. Folklorists who have studied the transmission of the sewer alligator legend have argued that *V* played a meaningful role in lifting the story from its status as a New York local curiosity into something with national and eventually international recognition. A story that travels by word of mouth has a limited and somewhat random geography. It goes where the people who heard it go, and it fades in places where no one is actively spreading it. A story that enters a novel, particularly a novel that is reviewed and taught and discussed in serious literary circles, acquires a different kind of durability. It becomes part of the record. It can be cited. It can be picked up by people who have never been to New York and have no personal connection to the sewer maintenance world, people who encounter the legend not as gossip but as literature. The albino detail in Pynchon's version is significant. In the oral tradition, the sewer alligators are generally not albino. They are simply large, dark, and present. But the albinism adds a layer of transformation mythology that deepens the structural logic already present in the story. Not only have these animals survived underground, they have been changed by it. The dark has done something to them. The underground has turned them into something different from what they were. This is a very old narrative pattern, the creature that descends into a hidden place and emerges transformed, and Pynchon's deployment of it connects the sewer alligator legend to a much larger and older family of stories about what transformation happens in the dark. Whether Pynchon believed the legend, or found it amusing, or was simply using it as a piece of New York texture for his novel, is not something the novel makes entirely clear. What is clear is that the novel treated the underground alligator hunt as a plausible piece of the city's texture. Strange, yes, but no stranger than the other things Benny Profane encountered in his movement through the darker corners of mid-century New York. The novel's tone toward the legend was not debunking, it was accommodation. The alligators are simply there, and Profane hunts them, and the reader is not invited to wonder whether this is really happening or not. The ambiguity is part of the novel's fabric. This ambiguity, a literary work, neither confirming nor denying a legend, but simply including it as part of the texture of a place, is one of the most effective mechanisms by which urban legends gain cultural authority. The reader does not finish *V, believing that the New York City sewers contain albino alligators in any literal sense. But the reader does finish the novel with the sewer alligator as a part of their mental image of New York, placed there by a serious literary work and therefore carrying a different kind of weight than a rumor heard from a coworker. The legend has been laundered in a sense through the prestige of literature. It emerges on the other side as something that belongs to the cultural landscape of the city, independent of whether it describes anything that has ever actually been there. The newspapers played a related role, though through a different mechanism and in an earlier period. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, American newspapers operated on a set of editorial conventions that treated individual testimony, particularly the testimony of named, apparently respectable individuals, as sufficient grounds for publishing a claim as news. Independent verification was not the standard that it would later become. A story told by a person who had no obvious reason to lie, told in a way that was coherent and specific and attached to a real location and a real date, was generally sufficient for publication. What this means for the history of urban legends is that the institutional authority of the newspaper, its physical presence as a printed object, its suggestion of editorial oversight, its implied claim that someone had checked what it said before printing it, was routinely extended to accounts that had not, in any rigorous sense, been verified. A story told by a single witness, printed in a major city paper without corroboration, became in the public record a documented event. And once an event was in the public record, it could be cited. Later accounts could refer to it. The legend could claim the newspaper as evidence. This is how a scattered collection of early 20th century animal sightings became the documented history of a phenomenon. Each individual newspaper account may have reflected a genuine encounter, a genuine animal, genuinely seen by a genuinely honest person, or it may not have. The accounts are difficult to assess individually now, and many are impossible to trace to any independent evidence. But collectively, they created a printed record that later accounts could point to, and that record was real, whatever the original events may have been. The newspaper archive is a history of what was reported, and what was reported is not always the same as what happened, even when every person in the chain of transmission was acting in good faith. The structure of this dynamic, the transformation of an uncertain account into a documented fact through the mechanism of print authority, is something Brunvand analyzed carefully, and the analysis extends well beyond the alligator legend. A great many things that American culture accepts as established history arrived through exactly this pathway, a single account, in print, with enough authority attached to it that no one went back to ask whether it was verified. The cumulative archive that results looks from a distance like evidence. Up close, it is sometimes something considerably softer than that. Brunvand's fieldwork notebooks, filled over decades of collecting and corresponding and comparing versions, contain something in the aggregate that was difficult to see in any individual account. across hundreds of versions of the sewer alligator story, collected from dozens of cities and spanning several decades. The variation in factual detail was enormous. The size of the animal ranged from 2 feet to 15. The location was sometimes a sewer, sometimes a river tributary, sometimes a drainage canal, sometimes simply described as underground. The witness was sometimes a worker, sometimes a curious child, sometimes a municipal official. The outcome ranged from the animal being captured to it escaping deeper into the tunnel to it simply disappearing. Almost nothing was consistent from version to version except the structural core. There is something large down there. Someone credible has seen it, and it has been there for years. What the variation reveals, in a way that no single account could, is that the legend is not a telephone game degradation of one original true story. It is a generative template, a structural pattern that people apply to new specific details in new specific cities, producing new specific versions that are all, in some sense, the same story. The New York version and the Chicago version and the version someone heard in Detroit and the version someone else swears happened in Philadelphia are not all copies of each other. They are all applications of the same template to a new set of local details. The template is what travels. The specific details are produced locally, on demand, as the template requires them. This is how oral tradition has always worked, long before anyone thought of it as a subject for scholarly study. A story that survives long enough acquires a kind of structural gravity, a shape that new material flows into, adapting to the template rather than being independently invented. The sewer alligator story has this kind of structural gravity. It is, in Brunvan's terms, a legend type, something more durable than any individual telling, something that will continue to generate new versions, as long as there are cities with hidden underground infrastructure and people who feel the particular urban unease that the legend addresses. What the notebooks could not contain was the full texture of any single telling, the specific kitchen table, the specific lamp, the specific relationship between the two people at the table, the specific quality of the pause before the story began. Each of those tellings was singular, local, and alive in a way that no archive can reproduce. The notebooks are the record of the pattern. The pattern is real, and the pattern is interesting, and the pattern reveals things about urban life that more conventional history does not easily capture. But the pattern exists because of thousands of specific, singular, unrepeatable moments in which one person decided it was worth leaning forward across a table and saying, "A friend of mine who works underground told me something." Those moments are their own kind of evidence, not of alligators in the sewers, of the particular texture of life in a modern city, and of what that life feels like from the inside, at a kitchen table, in the lamplight, when someone who knows someone who has been below comes home and tells what was seen down there. The image the notebooks bring to mind, hundreds of pages of close handwriting, each entry a different city and a different year and a different set of specifics arranged around the same unchanging core, is something like a long, patient form of listening. Brunvan collected these stories across decades, and the collection grew because the stories kept being told, and they kept being told because the cities kept being built, and the cities kept being built downward as well as outward, and the space below the street kept being invisible and unmapped and full of everything the surface life of the city had let fall through the cracks. The alligator is the thing that fell through the cracks and kept going. A small, harmless, inexpensive pet, the kind of thing a child could carry in a shoebox, the kind of thing that arrived by mail in a cardboard box with breathing holes that fell or was let go, or simply disappeared into the infrastructure, and then in the version of events that the legend tells, continued downward into a life that transformed it. The legend borrows its energy from the real history of the pet trade and the real architecture of the city and the real experience of the underground as a place that most people will never see, and it turns those real things into a story that is on its face almost certainly not true, and yet keeps being told by people who find it entirely believable. That combination, almost certainly not true, and yet entirely believable, is not a failure of reason. It is a feature of the legend's design. It is exactly the combination that makes a story worth telling across a kitchen table in the lamplight, worth passing from one person to the next along the long chain that reaches from some February morning in East Harlem all the way to tonight, to this moment, to the warm stillness of wherever the darkness now holds the person hearing it. The notebooks are closed for the night. The entries will still be there in the morning, each one a small, careful record of what one person heard from a friend who worked underground, each one a version of the same story, arriving at the same conclusions through a different set of local streets and local names and local details. The pattern that emerges from them when you hold them all at once is not the pattern of a deception or a mass delusion. It is the pattern of a city talking to itself about what it does not know about itself. In the dark, in the private grammar of a story that gets told because it addresses something that no more straightforward account has ever quite managed to say. The sewer alligator is a simple story at its most basic. Something small went into the dark and grew into something large. What the notebooks hold is the record of how many people, in how many cities, in how many kitchens and break rooms and back seats and late night conversations found that simple structure, a precise enough description of something in their own experience that they kept passing it forward, year after year, to the next person sitting across the table, leaning in, listening for the part about what was seen below. A piece of paper makes a particular sound when it has been folded for a long time and someone finally opens it flat. There is a soft resistance in the creases, and then a settling as though the paper is deciding to be still. A herpetologist sitting at a well-lit desk in the early 2000s would have heard exactly that sound, unfolding a photocopy of a newspaper report from February of 1935, smoothing it against the surface with one hand before reading the first line. The report described teenagers on a snow-covered street in East Harlem pulling something large and alive out of a manhole with a rope. The herpetologist would have read it with the specific kind of attention that scientists bring to old claims, careful, unhurried, professionally interested in what the record actually says, as distinct from what the story has since become. What the record says is modest. A large animal was pulled from a manhole. The newspaper reported it. The animal did not survive the encounter with the cold air and the shovels of the teenagers who found it. What the record does not say, what it cannot say, because no systematic investigation was ever conducted, is whether that single incident was the beginning of something, or simply an isolated strangeness on a winter morning in a city that has always been full of them. The question the herpetologist brought to that folded page was a specific one, the kind of question that seems almost too practical for a legend as vivid as this one. Not, could an alligator end up in a New York City sewer? That part, it turns out, is not especially hard to explain. But could one stay? Could one survive there? Not for a day or a week, but long enough to grow, to eat, to persist as something more than a brief and cold and disoriented animal finding its way through the wrong kind of dark? That is the question that zoology has a clear answer to, and the answer is patient and plainly stated and does not require any drama to make it interesting. The conditions inside the active sections of a major sewer system present challenges for an air-breathing vertebrate that go well beyond temperature alone. Hydrogen sulfide accumulates in the still sections of tunnel, heavier than air, settling into low pockets where it reaches concentrations that would cause respiratory distress in any mammal or reptile spending extended time there. Methane rises and collects in ceiling spaces. Oxygen levels in enclosed sections can drop below what sustained activity requires. The workers who enter these environments do so with gas monitors, with ventilation equipment, with protocols developed over generations of learning what happens when those precautions are skipped. An alligator entering the same space has none of those adaptations and none of those tools. Its respiratory system, which evolved in open subtropical wetlands where the air is warm and humid and rich, has no particular preparation for the specific chemical atmosphere of a confined urban drainage tunnel. And then there is the cold. The tunnels are warmer than the surface in winter, and that warmth matters. It is part of what makes the idea of a subterranean alligator feel almost plausible, almost possible, like a creature that found something useful in the urban underground. The temperature down there stays in a range that is not instantly lethal, not the kind of cold that kills quickly. But it is not the kind of warmth that an alligator needs to digest food, to maintain its immune function, to do the slow metabolic work that keeps a large reptile alive over months and years. The sustained low temperatures of a northern city's underground, even the insulated underground, fall below the threshold at which an alligator can properly process a meal. Below roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit, digestion slows. Below 60, it becomes largely ineffective. An animal that cannot digest cannot sustain itself, regardless of what prey might theoretically be available. The prey question is its own layer of the problem. Brown rats are genuinely present in New York City's sewer system, and they are present in numbers that have impressed and occasionally horrified city administrators for well over a century. An alligator that could hunt in that environment would not lack for potential food. But hunting requires movement, and movement in the dark, in flowing water, in confined tunnel space, against animals that are themselves highly adapted to that exact environment and have been navigating it for generations, is not straightforward. The rats know the tunnels. An alligator deposited there from a pet shop or an apartment does not. Zoologists and herpetologists who have assessed all of these factors together have arrived at a consistent conclusion. Long-term survival of an alligator in a New York City sewer, not a brief transit, not a day or a week, but the kind of sustained existence the legend describes, animals breeding, growing, establishing themselves over years, is in the assessment of everyone who has looked at the biology carefully, essentially impossible. Not impossible in the way that dramatic things are sometimes called impossible to heighten a story, but impossible in the specific, procedural organisms have requirements sense. The animal needs things that the sewer cannot provide, and the absence of those things is not a matter of bad luck or insufficient adaptation. It is a matter of what the animal is. The New York City Department of Public Works has held the same position consistently across many decades of being asked. No established population of alligators has ever been documented in the city's sewer system. The agency notes something that is, on reflection, quietly persuasive on its own. The sewer system is regularly entered and maintained by workers whose knowledge of its tunnels is detailed and intimate and has been accumulating since the 19th century. These are people who know what the tunnels normally contain, what is usually there and what is not, what a disturbance in the water means, and where an unusual sound comes from. The idea that a population of animals large enough to sustain itself over multiple years could escape their notice is not impossible in the way that makes a story interesting. It is improbable in the way that makes a story difficult to maintain. Workers would have encountered them. The evidence would have accumulated. The record, which has been searched, contains none of that accumulation. Teddy May, the former superintendent of sewers, whose account appeared in Robert Daly's 1959 book about the city's underground, described a different picture entirely: alligators in the tunnels, a campaign to remove them, men with guns and flashlights moving through the brick-lined dark. It is a vivid account, told by a named official with apparent authority, and it has carried real weight in the story's persistence. What it has not produced is corroboration. No departmental records from the period confirm the campaign May described. No contemporary news coverage documented the removal operation he detailed. The account lives in Daly's book, compelling and specific, and nowhere else in the official record. Whether May described something real, something embellished, something misremembered, or something constructed is a question that cannot be answered cleanly from this distance. What can be said plainly is that his account stands alone, and that standing alone is not, in historical terms, the same as being false. It is simply unconfirmed. What is confirmed, and what represents a genuinely different and more interesting chapter of this story, is what happens when released alligators reach open water rather than confined pipes. In the warmer months of the year, in the parks and ponds and slow-moving waterways of a northern city, an alligator deposited by a careless or overwhelmed former owner can survive for some time. The water is warmer. There is room to move. There is food. The animal can bask at the surface, which it cannot do in a sewer tunnel, and basking is not optional for an ectotherm. It is how the animal charges itself, how it raises its body temperature to the point where it can hunt and digest and function at anything like full capacity. In the autumn of 2001, a 3-foot alligator was spotted in the Harlem Mere, the small lake at the northern end of Central Park. The animal evaded capture for several days, moving through the shallow water with what observers described as unhurried confidence, the kind of movement that speaks to an animal that is not immediately distressed, even in an unfamiliar environment. Wildlife officers eventually captured it using a catch pole, wading into the shallows in the gray autumn light, with the pole extended toward a dark shape that moved slowly near the reeds at the water's edge. The animal was healthy. It was relocated. It had, in its weeks or months in the mere, apparently found enough to eat and enough warmth to keep going, at least into the early fall. A few more weeks and the water would have dropped below the temperature it could manage. The capture came in time. The Harlem Mere alligator is not a legend. It is a documented event, reported by the Parks Department, recorded in the wildlife management literature, the kind of thing that happens in a city where the keeping of exotic animals has been common and the regulations around releasing them imperfectly enforced. It is also, in its own way, a more interesting story than the sewer legend offers, because it is specific and real, and it places a living animal in a named location on a particular date, which is something the sewer legend has never quite managed to do. The same pattern of documented release and brief urban survival appears in cities across the country, with a consistency that has moved wildlife agencies from occasional curiosity to ongoing expectation. Chicago maintains a record of alligator-related calls that has remained relatively steady for years, the calls coming from park users who see something moving in the lagoons of the north side, from people walking dogs near the river who notice a shape near the bank that is not a log. In the summer of 2017, a 4-foot alligator appeared in Humboldt Park Lagoon on Chicago's west side. The city's animal control officers worked to capture it for 9 days. The alligator proved elusive in the way that alligators in open water tend to be. It moved at night, rested during the day in positions that were difficult to approach, and demonstrated no particular interest in making the process easier. The animal was eventually captured by a wildlife trapper and relocated to an alligator sanctuary in the south. Chicagoans had named it Chance the Snapper in the days of the search, and its capture was covered with a warmth that seemed to belong as much to the quality of the story as to any particular concern about the animal itself. Chance the Snapper is a recent example of something that has been happening in American cities at irregular intervals for the better part of a century, which is that the movement of alligators through the novelty and exotic pet trades, through the hands of owners who underestimated what a growing alligator requires, and finally into the nearest available body of open water, has produced a scattered and ongoing record of real alligators in real urban environments. They are not sewer animals. They are park animals, lagoon animals, river animals, creatures of the open and the surface, animals that need the sky above them and warm water beneath them, and the particular quality of sunlight that reaches the surface of a shallow pond on a warm afternoon. Every confirmed urban alligator in the documented record is a surface animal. Every one of them is an animal that ended up somewhere with water and warmth and some margin of room, not somewhere confined and cold and dark. The researchers and wildlife officers who have assembled this record are not working against the legend. Exactly. They are simply working with different material. The legend asks whether alligators live in the sewers and offers vivid, untraceable accounts as its evidence. The documented record asks where alligators have actually been found in northern cities and offers specific dates and places and the names of the officers who made the captures. The two bodies of material are not in conflict so much as they are answers to slightly different questions, and the difference between the questions is worth holding for a moment. The legend is partly about the sewers, but it is also about something underneath the sewers, something the sewers stand in for, the hidden parts of the city, the parts that are not inspected and maintained and mapped, the parts that might contain anything. The appeal of the sewer alligator is not really biological. An alligator expert who assessed the biology of the claim and concluded it was implausible did not thereby dissolve the appeal of the story, because the appeal was never quite biological to begin with. It was about what cities conceal. It was about the pleasure of imagining that the infrastructure beneath the street is not fully accounted for, that something large and prehistoric and entirely indifferent to human life might be moving through the dark just below the pavement. That impulse is not irrational, even if the specific claim it generates is not supportable. Cities do conceal things. The underground record of New York City is genuinely full of organisms that most surface-dwelling residents have never considered. The microbial communities that coat the surfaces of the older brick sections of the sewer system represent an ecology that formal surveys have only begun to characterize. Bacterial species adapted to the specific chemical gradients of sewage-rich water, to the irregular light and the fluctuating flow, to the particular temperatures of a subterranean environment. These are real and present, and in some cases poorly understood. Insect populations whose life cycles are calibrated to the rhythms of the underground, organisms that have been living in the infrastructure of the city since long before any of the buildings above it were built. These exist, and they are interesting, and they have received far less popular attention than the alligators that almost certainly do not. A researcher conducting a formal ecological survey of an urban sewer tunnel carries a field notebook that fills up with species names and population estimates, Small drawings made in the margins when something is present in large enough numbers to be worth sketching. The entries are careful and incremental, each one the result of sampling, observation, identification. The notebook does not make the same kind of claim the legend makes. It does not describe a single large dramatic animal in a specific location in a single dramatic moment. It describes communities, patterns, distributions, the way life organizes itself in the spaces that human engineering has created and does not fully inhabit. The brown rat that moves confidently through the same tunnels appears in that notebook too, noted without alarm and without enthusiasm as the established and extremely successful urban animal it is. There is something in the contrast between what the notebook records and what the legend claims that says something accurate about how attention works. The notebook finds what is actually there. The legend finds what the imagination needs to be there. Both are genuine human activities, and the fact that one of them produces verifiable data and the other produces durable stories is not a reason to regard one as more interesting than the other. It is, instead, a reason to notice that cities generate both, that the same streets and tunnels and infrastructure produce both kinds of account, and that the scientific record and the folkloric record are in their different ways both honest responses to the same underlying question: what is actually down there? What is actually down there? In the case of New York City's sewer system, is something that has been functioning for more than a century and a half, carrying the water and the waste of one of the densest concentrations of human life on the planet, maintained by workers whose expertise is deep and largely invisible to the people walking on the surface above them. The oldest sections of the brick-lined system predate the Civil War. The tunnels built in the 1850s in Brooklyn, hand-laid by workers whose names did not appear in the newspapers and whose knowledge of the underground was acquired by entering it, are still in use. Water still moves through them. The brick is dark with age and with the slow chemical work of more than 150 years of carrying what cities produce. The arch overhead in those sections is a piece of mid-19th century masonry, and it is still holding. That continuity has its own quality, separate from any question of what lives in the tunnels. The sewer system of a major city is one of the longest-running engineered systems in continuous operation anywhere in the world, and the fact of its operation is so unremarkable from the surface, so entirely absorbed into the background of ordinary daily life, that it rarely occurs to anyone to notice it. The legend, in a way, is one of the few forms of popular attention the underground infrastructure regularly receives. It takes an alligator, even an imaginary one, even a deeply implausible one, to make the tunnels visible. The story is a way of paying attention to something that almost nobody pays attention to otherwise. That is not nothing. The scientific conclusion that alligators cannot sustain themselves in the sewer system is not the end of what is interesting here. It is in some ways the beginning of a clearer and more varied picture. The confirmed record of urban alligators, the Harlem Mere animal, Chance the Snapper, the dozens of others documented across American cities over the past several decades, captured in park lagoons and river edges and backyard ponds during the warm months, represent something genuinely worth knowing. These animals arrived in cities through the same pathways the legend points to: the pet trade, the impulse to acquire something unusual and small, the problem of what to do with it once it grows. The legend did not invent those pathways. It noticed them, amplified them, and dressed them in a setting that made them more vivid than the sober record of wildlife management calls can easily be. Released pet alligators in open urban waterways are a real phenomenon with a real biological logic. A summer in a northern city's Park Lake, For an alligator that has been living in an apartment and is suddenly given space and water and warmth is a kind of brief flourishing, the animal doing what it is built to do in conditions that are, for a few months, close enough to its requirements to support it. The autumn ends that, the water temperature drops, the animal slows, and then slows further, and without the intervention of a wildlife officer with a catch pole, what happens next is not a mystery. Northern winters do not accommodate subtropical reptiles. The confirmed urban alligators, almost without exception, were captured or were found dead as the season turned. That seasonal arc, arrival in warmth, survival through summer, capture or death as the cold arrives, is a quieter and more melancholy story than the legend offers. In its way, it is a story about displacement, about an animal that ended up somewhere it was not equipped for through no fault of its own, doing what it could with what it had. The alligators that ended up in park lagoons in Chicago and New York were not there because they navigated to those places through underground infrastructure. They were there because someone carried them. And the parks, with their ponds and their margins and their populations of ducks and fish, and the slow warmth of summer, offered something more like survival than anything the sewers could have provided. The herpetologist at the desk, having read the 1935 newspaper report with careful attention, would have set it flat on the surface and considered what it adds to the picture. It adds one thing clearly: a real alligator on a real street in a real February, pulled from a real manhole. That event happened. What it does not add, because the record does not support it, is a population below, a colony, a generation, a lineage of underground animals moving through the brick tunnels beneath the Harlem streets. The record offers one animal on one morning. The legend built an entire underground ecology out of that morning, which is remarkable in its own right, and which says something worth sitting with about what a single striking image can generate when it falls into the right kind of soil. The city above the tunnels has changed enormously in the 90 years since that February morning. The street in East Harlem looks different. The buildings are different. The people are different. But the manhole cover is still there, a round iron disc set into the asphalt, and the tunnels below it are still there, and the water is still moving through the brick arches that were laid in the 19th century, and the workers still go down there with their gas monitors and their equipment and their knowledge accumulated across generations. What they do not find, and have never officially documented finding, is alligators. What they find is the infrastructure, functioning, carrying the weight of the city, doing what it has always done. The animal that the legend imagined into those tunnels, the large, patient, prehistoric creature moving through the dark in the warm underground, unseen and unsuspected, entirely at home in the hidden city, is a beautiful invention. It has the quality of a good myth, which is that it says something true even when it is not describing something real. The truth it says is that cities have depths that their inhabitants do not fully know, that the infrastructure beneath the surface is old and complex and largely invisible, that there is something in the human imagination that wants to populate the dark with something large enough to be worthy of it. The alligator is a good fit for that role. It is ancient in the way that the tunnels are ancient. It is patient in the way that brick is patient. It has been unchanged by time in a way that cities almost never are. What the real alligator is doing right now is not in the tunnels. The real American alligator lives in the warm coastal wetlands and river margins of the southeastern United States, in places where the water is slow and tea-colored from the tannins of the cypress and the tupelo, where the air above the water is warm and thick, where the light that falls through the canopy is dappled and long and gold in the late afternoon. The animal moves through that water with a slowness that is not lassitude, but efficiency, every movement calibrated, the wide tail sweeping in long lateral strokes that carry it forward with minimal effort. The sawgrass grows tall at the edges of the water. The herons stand at the margins, watching. The sky above the wetland at dusk is wide and orange and slowly deepening, and the alligator at the surface is barely more than a dark shape against the darker water, its breathing unhurried, its eyes catching the last of the light. That is where the animal is. That is the life it is built for, the life it has been living for a span of time that makes the 70 years of the sewer legend look very brief and very recent. The alligator's lineage extends back past the Eocene, through climates colder and hotter than any the current epoch has offered, through the arrival and departure of species that no longer exist, through geological changes that reshaped the continent around it. The animal that the teenagers in East Harlem pulled from the manhole in 1935 was carrying all of that history in its body, in the structure of its skull, and the arrangement of its scales, and the slow, patient rhythm of its cold blood. It ended up on a street in February,